Hello and welcome to the Fire Protection Association's Assembly Point podcast. I'm Howard Passey, Director of Operations at the Fire Protection Association. Today I'm joined by Nick Coombe, Vice Chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council Protection Committee and their lead on building safety, Andy Frankum, Chair of the National Social Housing Fire Strategy Group, and Steve Emery, who is the Fire Officer at Oxford University. And we're looking to explore vulnerable risks, specifically looking at social housing, care homes and educational settings and the impact on evacuation strategies. Good morning, everyone. Andy, if I could start with you first. In social housing, particularly, there could be a wide range of vulnerable people with very different needs, from visually and hearing impaired residents to those with mobility issues and people with mental health issues. How do you identify these different needs and assess how best to provide support?
Hi Howard, thank you for inviting me today, and what a question to get started on. Social housing providers have a number of ways that they can identify vulnerable individuals of some of the issues that you've talked about. That can vary across a number of different types of buildings. So there are providers that will be providing dedicated care and support, sort of extra care facilities and sheltered and supported housing, where predominantly they will have staff on site that will be working with residents to identify vulnerability. But there are other types of properties, such as general needs properties and high-rise buildings, for example, where there will be, to a lesser degree, some form of assessment based on the information that providers have. So that'll vary significantly. There is lots of different guidance around this, depending on what type of building you're looking at. So, for example, for supported and sheltered, there's the Specialised Housing Guide that National Fire Chiefs Council published, which highlights a person-centred fire risk assessment approach to identifying risks, especially around fire safety with individuals. And in sort of general needs blocks, where currently that information isn't always available. So, for example, if a resident contacts us and identifies that they've got a disability or they've got a condition, sometimes we see residents that have, just had an accident and they've ended up in hospital and, they've got a broken leg for a few weeks and then, they're back on track. So we get lots of different information, and we can get that through various points of contact that we have with residents, whether that be housing officers, fire risk assessors. When the fire risk assessors go out to blocks, they will do a sample check on doors and knock on doors and speak to residents and identify who might be at risk. There's different ways of looking at that. Where we identify someone can't self-evacuate, then there are processes in place to try and identify how that person could get out in the event of a fire. Various different risk assessments and various different information that we obtain from different places, really. So it's quite wide-ranging, but the key is that whatever we do should be person-centred, so that we're thinking about the resident in mind when we're coming up with solutions.
Yeah, it seems like you're tapping into lots of different sources of information, really, to gather the information you need. Steve, I suppose a similar question to you, although in this case we're maybe speaking about a more transient population. But as the Fire Safety Officer for Oxford University, how do you establish who are the most vulnerable people in the university setting, and what would you say were your top concerns for their safety?
Well, I suppose my top concern is that somebody will be left behind during an evacuation. And these people might be somebody who can't respond to fire alarm or evacuate for whatever reason. Our university isn't typical of all universities in that we have a collegiate system, so we have over 41 colleges and halls, and they provide the accommodation and give pastoral care to the students. So we only see the students when they've left the college and come to the university for their teaching and exams and things like that. But we work together very closely with all the colleges, and we have an outreach programme where we go out to schools. We generally know who's going to come to the university each term, and we have an admission policy which states that we'll make reasonable adjustments to help the individuals with their support and their requirements. And we have a disability advisory service which also provides information and advice on disability issues. And you know, for people with sensory or mobility impairments or long-term health conditions or specific learning difficulties, or somebody on the autistic spectrum or mental health difficulties, we're pretty convinced that we capture most of these people before they arrive, so that we'll know who they are.
You've explained that you know, that you have policies and procedures in place, but do you find circumstances where students don't necessarily disclose the disabilities they might have, which would enable you to ensure that the appropriate pastoral care or the appropriate evacuation strategies are put in place?
I'm pretty confident that we know most of the students that would require help. And if you look at the general population of disabled people in the working population, it's about 18%, but that's all ages, whereas the university, we have over 3,000 students each year that do have a disability and have declared it. And that's about 14% of our population. And we guesstimate that that would be about right for the number of disabled students in the student population.
Sure, and I presume that the college system, which you explained to us, would ensure that in the event, as Andy mentioned, that somebody were to have an accident and was temporarily in a cast and you know, had difficulty walking, that would be flagged to you through that.
It certainly would, yes, and we have many examples of where people have come forward to say, yeah, I've broken my leg, can't manage the stairs, I don't like an evac chair, what can you do for me?
Yes. Yeah, looking at you to provide the solution. Yeah, I can see that. You know, Andy might be slightly jealous of that particular approach in having such confidence in you know, in the status of the population, I suppose, which I don't think necessarily he has the same access to. I suppose, moving on a little, there's been considerable controversy around the effectiveness and cost of a waking watch in multi-tenanted buildings, and I'm aware of ongoing work headed by NFCC on producing guidance on this currently, which I'll ask you separately about, Nick, a little later if I may. But a question to both Nick and Andy, if I could ask you both. The need for implementation of a waking watch has been essential in circumstances where the nature of cladding on high-rise or high-risk premises presents a cause for concern. Recognising that it offers a solution for the building's general population, is it a good temporary solution for evacuation of vulnerable residents also? Nick, I'll come to you first on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. I think we need to be clear about what a waking watch is there for. So it's predominantly there to be the fire alarm, because these buildings don't generally have fire alarms in you know, or mass evacuation alarms as such, you know. So they're there for that, and it should be very, very temporary. They are a very, very short-term solution to that fire alarm, and I'll probably talk a little bit like that when we talk about the guidance. But NFCC are very clear that in these buildings where they've changed from stay put to simultaneous evacuation, everyone should be starting to move to evacuate, because these are failed buildings. They're not, you know, they haven't been designed correctly, and in some cases could have significant fire risk, as we saw in the tragic pictures at Grenfell Tower. So we firmly believe that those that are vulnerable need that assistance to help them at least start moving, or hopefully all evacuate. And that is a range of options. I think people get confused about PEEPs in the sense that they think they are, straight away a person in a wheelchair, but we all know there are loads of different vulnerabilities that people have, and there can be assistance to them to make them ensure them they can hear the fire alarm, start moving and start getting out of the building. It doesn't always have to be a physical staffing presence. But I think the real important bit with vulnerable people, I think Andy touched on this, is the person-centred approach. Let's make sure we can reduce the risk of the people having fires and being susceptible to fire first. That's that key message I want to try and get out of this, about that person-centred approach.
Thanks, Nick. Andy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Howard. I completely agree with what Nick's just said. I think it's absolutely fundamental that this has to be person-centred. I spent a lot of my time managing buildings where I used to sort of deal with lots of issues around mobility scooters, for example, in buildings, and sometimes residents would use them because they needed to, because they couldn't get about, they had a disability, or they didn't want to sort of tell everyone. But others, it was more of a lifestyle choice, and because they just wanted to use it, really. But the key was having that conversation with the resident about trying to understand what the fire safety implications were around that, of ignition, of if a scooter caught fire in a communal space, and what that impact would be on them, not just them, but their neighbours. So for me, it is absolutely about the person-centred approach. I think in terms of waking watch, I think there's been a lot of discussion about this. Some of it's controversial in some areas, and I think we've got to sort of bring this back, which is what NFCC are doing at the moment around guidance, about being really clear about what we expect organisations to do to manage fire safety risk in buildings, and where there are issues and it goes to simultaneous evacuation. Yes, absolutely, all those controls need to be taken in the short term, but when it becomes an issue where the cost of waking watch far outweighs the cost of any remediation or any other mitigation that could be put in place, then it clearly isn't a solution. So I think it's striking that balance, and ultimately it's about protecting residents.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So Nick, we've mentioned personal evacuation plans. We've mentioned a person-centred approach, and of course we're talking about vulnerabilities of residents in a vast array of different types of properties. But do you think that personal emergency evacuation plan and person-centred approach is going to be effective, not just in the general needs population that Andy's been talking about, but also in maybe higher risk situations such as care homes and schools and universities?
Yeah, I think actually they are where they can be most effective, in the sense that in schools and care homes they will know the needs of the individuals. I think, as just to quickly talk about the residential, they'll be. It's very difficult for responsible persons to know the complex needs of their residents, especially in kind of like leaseholder blocks. You don't know who's brought them, who's subletting them. But in a school and a care home, the needs are known to the staff, and that's the other key. There are always staff on duty that will know that and can plan regularly to ensure that the needs are met. I think in a care home in particularly, it's a person's needs can change during the day depending on what their needs are, and I think the care home should be flexible around that. I think that's one of the ones they can do. And of course the way care homes and their progressive horizontal evacuation method. You know, peeps are an essential bit for them. But again, it goes back to this person-centred approach for them. I still find it unbelievable in England we don't have suppression in care homes, which would be one of the easiest ways of reducing that risk. You know, I think it's a bane of my life that we still haven't got that. We've got, had a great win with sprinklers in now 11 metres in residential blocks of flats, but you've now got care homes and specialised housing that are lower rise, obviously because of the needs of the people who still don't have sprinklers, and we're not even catching up with our devolved assemblies who have got that. It just seems wrong to me that we're still having the debate. There can be no reason why you can't have suppression in these places, and that will help the system. If you look at the New Grange care home fire recently, where the fire and rescue service had to carry out over 20 rescues, 2 people sadly lost their lives. If that had been sprinkled, it might have been a different outcome. But I think the key bit about peeps in these places, you can train and prepare and plan, and they should be doing that. That doesn't mean in a care home you have to physically move people to evacuation, but you should be training your staff to be ready to evacuate any time, because they're 24/7. Schools not so normally, but schools normally regularly practice their drills. And again, even with schools, why are we still having a debate about sprinklers in schools? I hope the original BB 100 was meant to get against that. It was meant to be, you had to prove why it didn't need it, but it never worked. And now the latest draft seems to be only putting sprinklers in schools over a certain height. It's again, I'll go back, it really annoys me that we're still having debate about suppression in these types of places. We as a society have a duty to protect our most vulnerable, and I don't think we're doing that at the moment.
No, absolutely, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Nick. There's a whole can of worms there to discuss, really, but I fully agree with you. Why are we even thinking twice about protecting schools? Why are we even thinking twice about protecting care homes in that way? I appreciate cost benefit and all of those sort of things need to be considered, but I think the thing that's disappointed me the most, or disappointed us most maybe as an organisation, has been the fact that we don't seem to be learning the lessons from Grenfell. Yes, I appreciate lots of great work is going on to ensure that we have a completely different way of designing, agreeing the design, building, agreeing it's been done correctly, and then occupying premises. And when I've spoken to others on this, and even Dame Judith herself in one particular forum, and I said, why are we working with building heights, and why are we not working on the vulnerability as being the driver for the decision making? And the response I got back, and something that has been said more recently and far more frequently, has been this issue of proportionality. But to me, if we're looking at things proportionally, then vulnerability has got to be at the top of the list of the things that we consider. And if people are vulnerable, then why aren't we taking steps to effectively progress them and protect them as well as we know we can do? Nick, sort of off script slightly, but have you seen any examples where organisations are taking that decision, or maybe even Andy, taking that decision that regardless of what the regulation might say, the client is saying, hang on a minute, we need to protect these people. It's going to be far better for us if we do implement some form of suppression system.
I think we've seen some good examples around the social housing sector where people are about retrofitting, where they've retrofitted sprinklers in residential accommodation, and some pockets of success in certain areas, even in schools. I think, though, that we've still got this attitude of, unless the law says I have to, why should I? And I think that's that culture change that we need to, is at the heart of all this. Just because it says I can doesn't mean we should. That's the bit for me that I think, and how do we change that? And I think especially in this we are a money orientated society, and I think we're only going to feel the pressure more with Brexit and COVID, the cost of that to the country. So I think the government are looking to squeeze to get the money back they've spent out on them things. So it's going to be even harder to get that culture change, because it comes right down to the man in the white van or the woman in the white van who are actually doing the work. They've got their own families to feed, mortgages to pay, and they want to try and cut them costs. And I think it's going to be so hard. I think when Dame Judith did her report about we need the culture change, I was a little bit more optimistic than I am now, unfortunately, because of what's changed in the world. But there are pockets of excellence, and I don't think we sing enough about them. I think we do concentrate a bit too much on the negative sometime in our industry. We're very, you see all the social media posts about terrible installations and shocking fire suppression kind of compartmentation. I don't be singing enough about the people that and the organisations who really are trying to push that minimum standard. That I think that's the bit that's been embedded in our industry, is minimum has become the best. And not that's the minimum, and we should always be trying to achieve. But getting minimum's the best, and that can't go on. It can't go on, and we need to have that push, that culture change. Sure.
Andy, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, Howard, I think I'd agree with Nick that there's pockets of some excellence going on across the sector, for sure. I see that almost every day when I speak to people and speak to members. But I think there are providers out there that do want to go over and above and are going over and above. We've seen the early adopters doing trials around enhancing, what the process is going to look like for everyone in the future. But we've also seen other providers, wanting to sort of go above and beyond just the 18-metre ceiling. So for example, I previously worked for a provider that wanted to include all their 6-storey blocks, in that same regime, although there wouldn't be a regulatory requirement to do a safety case. They wanted to go through that process because that constituted a significant risk for that organisation and for those residents. And the message I get back from providers all the time is that they don't want a two-state system where, bottom line is all residents matter, no matter who they are or where they live. And there's a lot of good professionals out there that want to drive that and want to deliver that, but that's not consistent. And so I think, what we've got to do in terms of culture changes is that we've got to drive that. The sector's got to drive that. There are different sectors, the fire safety sector, the construction sector. There's lots of other people involved, architects and designers and everyone else, but it's the social housing is obviously my area of expertise, but, from a housing point of view, we've got to drive that forward. We've got to really set the bar in terms of what we'll accept and what we won't. And I think as soon as we start to do that, and we embed competent teams in place as a part of that solution, and we increase the levels of competence, then I think we'll be heading in the right direction for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Needs some leadership, doesn't it? And it's good to dwell on those examples of where people are going above and beyond and are looking to, as you mentioned, maybe not necessarily adopt what we might perceive as a two-tier system, but are just looking at vulnerability and dealing with it. So, Steve, just thinking about the environment that you work in, are you able to share and outline what evacuation strategies you have in place for supporting vulnerable people in the case of a fire in one of the university buildings? And what would you say are the main challenges that you face in that kind of environment, And are there any specific learnings that you could share?
Yeah, we do quite a lot for them. And the first thing I must say is that all our new buildings are fitted with sprinklers as a matter of policy. All our new buildings have non-combustible insulation, and they're all built with the idea that a fire could occur and we should, do something about it. There is one thing that we don't do that seems to be commonplace, and that is in terms of disabled refuges. At the moment, building regulations don't require a disabled refuge in flats, but we provide them anyway. And we have, instead of the voice system of communication between a refuge and somebody down on the ground floor, we have a call point system where we have yellow call points. And what happens there is when somebody presses this yellow call point, it comes up on the fire alarm panel. So it's in the fire alarm protected circuits. And at the fire alarm panel, somebody that goes there will see that somebody's in a refuge, presses the light that comes up, because the light is also a button, and that gives a reassurance light in the refuge so that the person there knows somebody's going to come and help them. And I thought this would have been ideal when Hackett first suggested that fire brigades ought to have a monthly update on who requires a PEEP in their buildings. I was thinking that doesn't really help, because the person that requires help might be out shopping at the time of the fire or visiting friends. You'd never have it up to date. Whereas if they had a yellow call point, they could actually say, yeah, I'm here in my flat waiting for you. So I thought that was quite a useful thing to do. The university itself has postgraduate accommodation, and that's sometimes families, and sometimes the families have disabilities. And in our postgraduate accommodation, we have a system of fire wardens. So first of all, we have an L1 fire alarm system in those blocks, so it's simultaneous evacuation. We have sounders with beacons inside the flats. And we give a 20% discount on rent to those that volunteer to be fire wardens. And then we train those fire wardens in evacuation procedures. Wow. They go knocking door to door in case of alarm. They're trained in the use of fire extinguishers. So it's sort of quite a robust system. It takes a lot of effort from the university, because we've got to do the training and to repeat it every term as the students carry on. And apart from that, we have buddies for students that require buddies. So if they're in one of our teaching buildings, they'll have a buddy with them who will accompany them to the refuge. And of course, we provide evacuation lifts in all our new buildings.
That's incredibly positive to hear. First and foremostly looking at the new build process and ensuring that you're doing the very best that you can, but using a real mix of different techniques and strategies to ensure safety and arrangements are relevant in each of the buildings. That's a really interesting approach to take. There's no one size fits all. It's what works best in each circumstance.
In the 1990s, when I was in Bath, we persuaded one of the care providers there to put sprinklers in their accommodation, and it was a new build. They were going for sheltered accommodation and then nursing home, so that people could go in through. And it was the first complex that had sprinklers. We were able to provide them with much better management procedures during the fire evacuation by having the sprinklers. But we're quite proud that happened on my watch.
Going to make a huge difference. Yeah, well done. Nick, sorry, you were going to.
Yeah, just something we're not seem to be covering on this podcast, but I think Steve made some really good points about the role technology can play in improving vulnerable people. You know, fire alarm technology has moved on so much better. You know, since it, you know, and it's always evolving. And things like lights outside flats if people are vulnerable. There is so much more we can do. Even progressive horizontal evacuation or progressive evacuation, fire alarms can do that now in flats. So you know, I'm not saying get rid of stay put, but there could be a system in place where if the fire did start to spread, it would move people because the alarms would go. There is so much more. I don't think we use technology enough, you know, to improve the situations, and it's something again I think we should be looking at, you know, around our building regulations and that, because again they ask for the bare minimum all the time.
I was just going to butt in there, and I've just finished a project in Ireland. It was a research project into modern technology and helping landlords to manage their properties, and it was all with the idea of getting city centre properties back into use. But the technologies they were using was interesting. For instance, a device that looks at the stove, and if any of the pans overheat and there's nobody present, it switches the stove off. Another device looking at doors that should be fire doors and closed, they're monitored, and if a particular fire door gets wedged for more than a certain a number of minutes, then the landlord is notified. And some really sort of intrusive things, but there's a listening device that can listen to your appliances in the kitchen. It listens to people as well, but it ignores them. But if a tap's dripping, it'll send a signal to the landlord that a tap's dripping. Or if a fridge is not clicking on and off with its thermostat, it'll notify the landlord. And it all sounds very intrusive, but the aim is for the landlord to have a dashboard so that they know which of their properties are having problems, and then they can go and address them.
Sure. Even if that was just applied to, you know, to more vulnerable residents, it would be a step in the right direction. And I think, as Nick's saying, the use of technology can really improve things. We've seen, you know, the use of multi-sensor type detectors have a massive impact on the number of unwanted fire signals, and you know, forced call-outs for fire and rescue services. Absolutely no reason why we can't continue to apply that kind of approach, and you know, making better use of technology in keeping people safe, most definitely. It sort of brings us on just to talk about the Waking Watch again, and which we considered very briefly earlier, in the support of evacuation of residents in high-rise blocks. And I mentioned earlier that NFCC have been doing some work and producing some guidance on this at the moment. I'm just wondering if, Nick, you could share a little bit more about where that sprang from and what it hopes to achieve.
Yeah, thanks. Sure. I mean, I think first thing to say is Waking Watch is not a new concept. I think people think we invented it after Grenfell, but it's been around a long time. The classic example in the past was a hotel which fire alarm showed a fault and wasn't working. They'd provide a Waking Watch. You would walk the floors for a couple of hours until the fire alarm engineer came in and fixed it, and it was always that short term. So, following the tragic events of Grenfell, local authorities were tasked to find out where that similar type of cladding was on other high-rise buildings. And probably about a week after Grenfell, we discovered the Chalcots estate in Camden, where 5 blocks, tower blocks, had to be decanted because of the risks there, and it was over 2,000 families being put into temporary accommodation, which was a massive workload for the local authority and other services. And it became clear that this could happen all around the country, so something different had to be thought of to avoid that, but ensuring that people were relatively safe and they could stay in their properties. So that was the aim of it. And so a group of fire professionals sat round in London Fire Brigade HQ to write a bit of guidance that at the time we thought would be needed for about 6 months until this problem would go away. And of course, developments have shown that that's not the case. And here we are 5 years later, and we're now on our 4th edition of the guidance. We've just gone out for consultation, and again, we're learning lessons all the time from what's happened, and you know, the leaseholders who are having to pay for this, obviously that wasn't considered at the time, because we were talking purely fire safety. You know, we make a thing that makes people safe. We hadn't thought who's going to pay for this, because you know, that's not normally a kind of real consideration in workplaces, etc. Because if you're running a business, if you can't afford to keep people safe, you shouldn't be running a business. But residential is completely different, and there's so many different types of residential management, etc. You know, I mean, I've learnt so much about that in the past 5 years. But of course, the ultimate aim of the guidance is to keep people safe and to keep people in their homes. So we try to improve. We try to make it really clear the waking watch should be very, very short term. You need a fire alarm in as quick as you can. The government have stepped in with the fire alarm fund to help that go quicker. We've talked about residents being the waking watch to reduce the costs, and even around the evacuation management, trying to reduce that. And we're looking even tighter at that to really try and instead ensure that baseline of safety. And this is the bit I struggle with. At one bit I said we keep trying to do the bare minimum, and here I'm trying to do the bare minimum because I want to try and reduce the cost to people who are at no fault of their own. So it's a kind of, you know, it's a real kind of gamble in that sense that, you know, I'm playing against that. But, you know, we need to do that, and hopefully, you know, we are starting to see the peak of these buildings now dropping off, getting remediated, because that's the key. Once they're remediated, then we can move away from that. But the guide, probably a month or two away from the next edition coming out, because obviously with the Fire Safety Act imminently, and maybe some of the Grenfell recommendations, I think we don't want to put something out that's immediately out of date. So we're just holding back on that for the moment. But, you know, people like Andy on the call have contributed, and, you know, it always gets called the NFCC guide, and my inbox is full from leaseholders who are saying you're costing me a fortune, etc., etc. And it is a you know, a sector guide, but I do really, you know, appreciate this situation, you know, and if I could solve it with a magic wand I would, but I can't. What I want to do, because I think the alternative is you can't stay in your homes, and then you may still have a mortgage to pay, and then you've got to pay for temporary accommodation because local authorities couldn't house you all. So it is that real catch-22 situation we're in. But I'm hoping the next guide will be better and more kind of succinct. I think people have interpreted it wrongly, sometimes just through the way it is, but I think there are people out there who have made money out of this, and that's terrible, and I hate that. I hate being part of that. You know, I want to ensure that people are safe, but people are not ripped off, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, exactly as you said, it's meant to be a temporary solution. You're trying to provide guidance as to, you know, how the, you know, how owners and occupiers can reduce the financial burden whilst maintaining the safety of the, you know, of the premises and the occupants. So, I think it's a, you know, incredibly worthwhile task and definitely heading in the right direction. So a question for Steve and Andy, really. We've talked about the approach that you take to ensuring that you know who's vulnerable in the environments that you're responsible for, and clearly for Steve, there's a maybe an easier and a more robust process given the nature of the premises that you know, allows the university to have some clarity over who's there and potentially vulnerable. Andy, a slightly different kettle of fish, particularly as even Nick mentioned earlier. You might have leaseholders and you've got, you know, absolutely no understanding of who the occupants might be. But how do you handle circumstances where a vulnerability is identified and it sort of falls outside of the usual, or it happens at a time when there is an emergency and you have to deal with it? Are you able to plan for that kind of thing? And if so, how? Is it through training or? or really just relying on the experience and competency of those involved to ensure the right thing happens?
Okay, thanks, Howard. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're always thinking about what if scenarios. So as part of any sort of emergency planning that we have in place, it's thinking about that we know that some residents won't disclose disabilities or that they can't self-evacuate, so we've got all the information that we've identified earlier through the various sources, but ultimately we have to plan for those things. So we have to make assumptions that we might have 2 or 3 people or more, in a block of flats that can't get out, and ultimately, that's where fire and rescue service come in if our plans fail and we've done everything that we can. But we should never get to that point. We should always try to plan ahead, to think about those scenarios and think about how we could manage that risk. But for me, that links in with the resident engagement work. Really, it's really about how we speak to our tenants, our residents, how we understand what happens in a building, and that should feed into those plans. And if we risk assess correctly and we've got the right plans in place and we've got good communication with residents, and it is about communication. I think sometimes we talk about resident engagement as in that we need to engage a resident in that, but I think it's about having a two-way conversation, really, and rather than them being engaged in it. We know some people won't ever be engaged in that process because, they lead busy lives. They just want to get on with stuff. They don't want to have that conversation with landlords every second of the day, because in their mind, fire risk to them isn't even on the agenda, or is not even considered as something that it only affects them when something happens. Like there's cladding on the outside of a building, and then it does become important because they're then worried about their safety. So it's about how can we proactively do that to make sure that residents feel safe, and we can do lots of things around that to share information, to communicate with residents, to make them feel part of the process. But likewise, there might be some residents that don't want to get involved in that, and sometimes we have to find a way to at least give them information, and know that they've received that information, and then sort of in the rounded view of making sure that they're aware, if nothing else, and then hopefully your plans are tested. This is where the safety case regime will come into play, about how robust your building is, how safe it is, and ultimately, what's the measure of residence, and I think for me that's key. It's about if you were putting your own family into that block of flats, are you happy to do that? And if the answer's no, then that's where you've got to start looking at what you're doing and to improve on that to get to that place.
How about from your perspective, Steve? I suppose I mentioned it's a slightly different kettle of fish, as you might say, in a university environment. Certainly, given what you've already explained to us in terms of the robust nature and availability of information that you have, right from the get-go. But how does it sit with you in those circumstances?
I think there's a few things that we've got in our favour. The first is that we've got no blocks over 11 metres, because it's a planning decision across Oxford, and obviously this doesn't apply to every university. Our advisory service is really keen on finding people who have hidden disabilities, and in fact there's a really good YouTube clip, one on telling us about your disabilities, and there's another one from Southampton University about hidden disabilities. And so it doesn't matter which university you come from, there will be an advisory service there to help you in that way. And the third thing that we're really lucky in is that we have our own security services. And they used to be a police service up until 2004 when the local constabulary took over. But they are our alarm receiving centre, and they have a large number of mobile patrols, and they will go to a building before, well, as soon as the alarm sounds. They'll contact the building manager, and if they don't get a reply, a patrol will go. And one thing we haven't sort of mentioned, which I think is quite important, is the policy of the local fire and rescue service about responding to automatic alarms and who's going to call them, and whether it's 24 hours a day or whether it's they won't respond during the day. And currently, Oxfordshire Fire and Rescue, they will respond to automatic alarms between 10 in the evening and 6 in the morning. So, but it's not like that across the board. We're just fortunate.
Yeah, there's another can of worms and another podcast really. I think if we wanted to dig into that, and maybe best avoid it at the moment. But thank you. It's good to see in the round what you're able to achieve with with that sort of more enclosed environment, I suppose. I think it's probably time to wrap things up. So just lastly, a very big thank you from me and from the FPA for you to take some time out today to chat with us. It's been a fascinating discussion. It's gone on far longer than I'd anticipated. So thank you for being patient and sticking with the discussion. But I think it's probably a function of where we are at the moment. People want to learn more. There is so much to take on board, and there is so much learning that people can take from different sectors. So thank you very much indeed for your time.